I was born in a small place called Hanneke, which is near Breda, on the 10th of February 1943. But I wasn't registered until after the war, because my mother had me in hiding at the home of a midwife, Mrs. Soontjes, who looked after her and me for 10 days. And present at my birth were my uncle Jaap, my mother's brother, who had actually found Mrs. Soontjes prepared to deliver me, and her GP and my uncle's GP were also present. We were with the midwife for about 10 days, and then my uncle Jaap and Aunt Nell, his wife, came to collect me. And mother had breastfed me 1 minute, and the next minute she was given some surgical spirit and cotton wool, because there was no more breastfeeding, because she had to go into hiding. And although she very seldom talked about the war, it was a taboo subject in our family, she did tell me about her terrible fear of giving up her firstborn child, only 10 days old, not knowing if she was ever going to see me again. And then she went off to a town called Helmond to join my father in hiding. And I went with my uncle to his house, and my first bed was actually the case that used to house the vacuum cleaner, because in those days the vacuum cleaner were like sausage shaped, right. And so it was a bit like a coffin-like case in black leatherette, and they had made that into a little bed. So that case was put on the back of my uncle's bicycle, and that's how I was transported to his house, so they didn't know I was actually in it. My uncle wrote a book which I've brought. It's in Dutch, and it's called My Holland of Yesteryear. Yeah. And in there he describes the vacuum cleaner case, and he describes the journey to, well, first of all, the journey to take my mother from where they used to live in Apeldoorn to Breda, to get her to this midwife, and then it describes the journey from the midwife to his home in Breda. Yeah. And whilst there, before I was 6 weeks old, there was a raid. The Germans used to raid a lot of homes, especially if they were suspecting that there were Jews living there. And somebody must have told the Germans that there were Jews living there, but fortunately my uncle and his wife were out. But his younger sister, Lena, who was also obviously the sister of my mother, she was only 16 and looking after me when the Germans wanted to search the house. And she actually had the presence of mind, even though she was only 16, to say that she'd heard her uncle and aunt say that there were Jews living next door, but that they had disappeared. And she had come to live with them because she was orphaned in the bombardment of Rotterdam, which was a total lie. Well, the Germans wouldn't take no for an answer, and they marched to the house, and fortunately, I didn't cry. So God smiled on this little baby, and hence I'm here to tell the tale. And my aunt, it left my aunt with a terrible fear. Yeah. And about 20 odd years ago, she jumped from a 5th floor apartment, thinking that the Germans were there to deport her. So, yeah, very, very sad indeed, because she saved my life. And she was very, very brave in doing so, and very sad that she was troubled mentally all the rest of her life by saving my life. I initially stayed with my uncle, but after the raid, it wasn't safe to stay with them anymore. So my uncle had heard about a children's home, which children who were ill used to come and convalesce, and that was with a lady called Sister Pop. And Pop means doll in English. She had never married, but had adopted 2 children, one called Beb and one called Francine, not Jewish children, and she wasn't Jewish. It was near woods. The address was Baronielaan in Breda. I don't know the number, but the house is still there, because about a couple of years ago, my nephew took me there. And unfortunately, we couldn't go in the house because the lady who lived there was ill. But in those days, they thought if you were ill and you were taken to the seaside or to near where there was woods, that was very good air, and that would make you better. But of course, I didn't go for that reason. I went there because I was a Jewish child. And I found out in 1992, when I attended the Hidden Child Conference in Amsterdam, that there were more people there. And although I suspected there would be more people there, and at that time I hadn't received my uncle's book yet, so I didn't know anything about it. But through a lady in London called Nicole David, who organized the very first Hidden Child Conference in New York, and sat next to a Dutch journalist on the way back to Europe, who begged her to organize this 1992 conference in Amsterdam. I asked her how you could find out if there was somebody who'd also been with Sister Pop as an example, and she said, put a note on the notice board. Yeah. So that's what I did. I put a note on the notice board, told them my name and my maiden name. My maiden name is Bendik. And then I wrote, is there anybody here who was also with Sister Pop during the war? And if so, please meet me at 6 o'clock under this sign. And then, of course, the day progressed and we had different discussions and we had lectures, etc. And suddenly one realized that 6 o'clock was coming near. So with trepidation, I actually, not knowing what to expect, I went to this notice. And as I neared, I saw a man and a woman hugging each other. Yeah. And I didn't know if these were the people that were waiting for me, but as I got closer, they looked at me and I looked at them and they said, you must be Hanneke. And I said, yes, I was. And so there was a very emotional reunion because my mother couldn't tell me anything about being a little baby because I was 2.5 before my mother got me back. But they could. And so one was Jenny Unterman. She now lives in America. And she and her sister, who was not at the conference, had been with Sister Pop. And their family all perished. And then the other one was Harry Del Cano, Harry, and he had been a pediatrician in the Netherlands. And the two of them told me that our hair was bleached because the Germans thought if you were blonde you couldn't be Jewish. Yeah. So they thought we were Aryan, which was quite good. And they also told me that Jenny's sister was old enough to sometimes change my nappy, and that they sang little nursery rhymes to me. And the other startling thing was, well, there were two. One was they admitted to each other they'd been scared stiff of the 2 dogs that Sister Pop had. And they hadn't really wanted to admit it because they used to bark a lot if they came near my pram, because they were very protective of me. And then the other story was that there was a little boy there whose father was a German that didn't really know much about the mother, but this chap was very fond of children and regularly visited his son. And whilst there, he would pick up small children, and I was one of the children he picked up and put on his lap and sang nursery rhymes to. Of course, I have absolutely no memory of that. It's their story to tell me, but it was quite an amazing thing to find out, really. And initially I was very much still in touch with Jenny, but that's no longer the case. But certainly I'm still in touch with Harry. And he told me that when they had a celebration in Breda, the town that I was registered, I think it was for the millennium or maybe thereafter, they had an exhibition to do with the war. And Harry was asked to open this exhibition. And by chance, Jenny had been in the Netherlands, so had gone with him and Harry's wife. Yeah. And they had met a lady called Mrs. Dasberger, who also remembered me as a baby, but I haven't met Mrs. Dasberger yet. So I'm hoping that one day when I visit Holland again, that we can organize a meeting to meet her as well. In my family, there was my mother, Grietje, my father, Ben, and then I'm the eldest, Hanneke, and then my sisters, they're twins, Marja and Marijke. They were born on the 12th of November 1945. And then my younger sister, Anna Louise, who was born on the 8th of August 1949. Sadly, my younger sister, Annelies as we called her, She died 8 years ago, and one of the twins, Maya, died in 2010 in South Africa. So there were 4 girls in the family, and the sister who's left is called Marijke, and Marijke sadly has Parkinson's, so it's difficult for her to do many things. You know, she's restrained in what she does. From being Breda, when we were liberated and when my parents came to collect me, we went back to the town where my parents lived, which is Apeldoorn, which is the town where Princess Wilhelmina had a palace. And my mother told me that when the twins were born, she used to get milk from royal cows because twins were rather special. And of course, everything was rationed in those days. I haven't got any ration cards, but whilst we were all in hiding, because my parents, as I told you before, were in hiding in Helmond by the family Flemings. And I have a book with me in which the house that they were hidden in, and their story is actually related in that book. Then I went to school, primary school, the first nursery school in Apeldoorn, and then because my father couldn't fight during the war, when Holland was freed, they looked for volunteers to go out to Indonesia. And my father went out to Indonesia with the Dutch army. He came to Aldershot in England to do his training, and he then went out on the New Amsterdam from Southampton, and I have got telegrams to show that he went on the New Amsterdam. And whilst he was traveling to Indonesia, he got a telegram to say that my sisters were born, so he knew about it. But again, he didn't see them, of course, until he came back. So then he actually initially needed a job, of course, to work. He was a qualified butcher because his father had... Sorry? Yeah, well, he never practiced because my granddad, Marcus, he actually had a farm with lots of cows, and he sold his cows to his brother, who had the kosher butcher shop in Veendam in the north of Holland. And my father did the training to be a butcher and maybe worked a little bit in the family butcher shop. But after the war, he first, through my uncle Jaap, got into the cycle business, but decided he wanted something different. And his cousin, Eddie van Esso, he was in the jute business. So my father joined him in the jute business in Meppel, which is in the north of Holland. And so we all moved to Meppel. And then after a number of years, my father set up an office in Rotterdam because the exchange was in Rotterdam. So we then all moved to Rotterdam. And I did my secondary education in Rotterdam. Unfortunately, because I had glandular fever in my last year at school, I failed my final exam by 1 point, which happened to be German, very poignant. And then I actually went to do training as a nurse in the only Jewish hospital in the Netherlands, which was in Amsterdam, but now is in Amstelveen, which is the central Israeli ziekenhuis. When we lived in Rotterdam, I went to the synagogue to Cheder, but I wanted to also go to the services, and initially I did, but we lived too far away from the synagogue. So when I went to synagogue, I went on the tram. And although I got off the tram a couple of stops before synagogue, I was spotted. And the rabbi, in those days, the Orthodoxy was very strict. The rabbi couldn't tolerate it, so he came to see my parents and asked for me to go to stay with a Jewish family near the synagogue on Friday night and not go home until night after Shabbat. And my parents felt that they were responsible for me, so they didn't want that to happen. So that was the end of going to synagogue for quite a while until I came to England. My parents, because of the war, were quite scared about being recognized as Jews. They never denied they were Jews. We always knew that we were Jewish children. They told us that we were Jews. We had some Jewish families that we knew, But they both were members of the synagogue in Rotterdam. My father would go to synagogue on high holidays. My mother didn't really go. I cannot remember my mother going to synagogue, although after my father died, I did go with my mother once to Sukkot. But it wasn't inside the synagogue, of course, it was outside. She arranged for us to go to Sukkot, which was really special. But sadly, my father, he contracted a kidney disease, and it was really put down to the horrors of the war. And in the end, he actually died of a heart attack on the way to hospital while my mother was driving him. He was on a very, very strict diet.
Was he diabetic?
No, my father wasn't, but my grandfather was. My father's father was a diabetic, and so was my father's brother, Leo. But Leo survived the war. But my grandfather, Marcus, and his wife, Anna, and their daughter, Bartje, did not survive the war because they lived in Apeldoorn, and when the Germans demanded for the Jews to gather in the park in Apeldoorn, my grandfather felt he should go because he knew he couldn't survive the war without his insulin. And as his daughter and wife were at home with him, they went with him, and they perished in Auschwitz. And I have a book with me, which is about the town Veendam, which is in the north of the Netherlands, in which they all are described. I have another little book with me, which is about Apeldoorn, and they're also in that book. And then in 2006, the Intercontinental Friends of Bradford, Harrogate and Leeds produced a memorial book, and I was privileged enough to remember my grandparents and Aunt Bartje in there. But that was early 2006. And after my mother died, and I found the false identity papers of my parents and grandparents, and I found their marriage books of my grandparents and my parents. In my grandparents' papers, there I found that my mother had had another brother, Abraham.
An older brother?
An older brother.
Yeah.
And I think there was something wrong with him. I have a photograph at home. I'm never sure if it is him or not, of a very, very large man. And I have a very, very vague memory of my mother once saying that she had a brother called Bram. She didn't call him Abraham. And that he had a disease whereby he was very big. So I thought he may have had elephantitis or something like that. And this photo of this man looks as if he's like a giant. I have no knowledge of him, except that he was in this home. And the home was a Jewish home. And the home was raided by the Germans, and they all ended up, and I don't know which concentration camp, but I suspect it was Auschwitz. And I also found a card, which I've brought with me today, in which my mother inquires about what happens to her brother. And there's a reply from the Paris Council of this particular town, Nunspeet, I think it was, where they said that he was deported, but it doesn't say where to. And sadly, he's not remembered in the book. And if ever that book was reprinted, I would want him to be in there. Because when I do my talks, I always say how sad I am. That's why I mention him, so he's remembered and lives on in our memories because of that, even though I never knew him. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my parents, really, about their hiding place in Helmond. It was a customer of my uncle Jaap. My uncle really was a very brave man because he found hiding place for his parents in a town called Heerlen, which was a mining town. And both my mother's parents and obviously Oom Jaap's parents survived. Then he found a hiding place for my parents by a customer of his in Helmond. They had a house which attached to the house was which we would possibly call a barn, but it was a warehouse. And in between the warehouse and the living house, as it were, was a space upstairs. And that's where my parents were hidden, with very little light in this space. And you could only get to it when you were on the landing, climbed on a chair and got into it. And I told you about the raids in Breda. Well, at a certain stage, there were also raids in Helmond, and Mr. Flemings got fried and told his wife to get rid of the Jews, which you could understand. And what happened was that my parents were invited down for a cup of coffee or a drink before they were to leave, obviously scared and not knowing where to go. And as they said goodbye in the warehouse to Mr. Flemings and walked out, Mrs. Flemings beckoned them and got them back in the house through the front door and back in their hiding place. And for the rest of the war, Mr. Flemings and his son did not know that my parents were still there. So just think how quiet they had to be. Yeah. And Mum told me once, you know, as a young child, you may not like spinach or something else, and you get told off. There are lots of people who are hungry, and you know. Anyway, she said she really knew about hunger. She said, wait till you've only got one slice of bread each, she said. And I just cut off a little corner of this bread and kept it. And then at night time I gave it to your father. And the reason for that was I couldn't stand his stomach, listening to his stomach rumbling. And so she gave her last, that's true love, to give your last piece of bread, not knowing if you get more the next day. So yeah, that was quite brave of Mrs. Flemings, really. Now, in the book, there's a photograph of my parents and my sisters. It should have been me, of course, because my sisters were born after the war. And I was staying at Hanneke in Maastricht, one of the twins. This is my mother. And the next day, during the night, I woke up and thought, oh, I mustn't disturb my mother. So I went to sit in the lounge. On the coffee table was this book about Helmond, and it's actually literally translated under the protection of the angel Gabriel. And I'd never seen the book before, but as soon as I saw Helmond, I thought, oh gosh, that's the place where my parents were hidden. I picked up the book and opened it, and it's absolutely pure coincidence. I don't know why. It opened up on the photograph of my parents. I could not believe it. And not knowing if I could get the book, I searched for some paper and I found a big envelope and wrote it all out by hand during the night. Didn't go back to bed. And then when my mother appeared for breakfast, I said to her, why didn't you tell me about the book? She said, child, you mustn't believe everything that is in the book. Well, only last May, I visited my Uncle Jaap's wife, who's now well in her 80s. My uncle has died many years ago.
Your auntie?
Yeah, and I said to Tante Gra, you know, why was Mother always denying everything? She said, about the book, I said to her, you know, about this book about Helmond, she always said, don't believe anything. And also about the book that your husband, my Uncle Jaap, wrote, don't believe anything that's in the book. And she said, in Oom Jaap's book, there was one error, but she said the rest is absolutely true. And she didn't tell me what the error was, but it was obviously not significant. And the other book, she said, your mother was interviewed by people. So why she denied it, I can't tell you. But she wouldn't, I think it was, because all the photographs I have, which I brought, some of them, if you hold them in a certain light and they're black and white, you can see they're wearing their stars. And I wonder if she didn't want us to know that they had to wear their stars in the war, or if it was still the fear that was within her, that she couldn't talk about it.
Probably. Sounds likely.
Terrible time they had. But I also know that she was interviewed because she had help from social workers to do with Jewish welfare in the Netherlands, Joods maatschappelijk werk. That they have social workers, a bit like AJR have here, and that she was interviewed, and somewhere, I think there will be tapes of my mother, that she spoke about all the experiences. My mother had a tick in her shoulder, and that all came from the war. We didn't know any better, but she would always go like, yeah. And of course, when you live in England, you forget about it, and then when you see her again, you think, God, it's much worse. But soon you get used to it again, and it seems to be the same, you know. Yeah. I think they definitely did have a terrible time. The other thing I remember as a child, that sometimes I woke up in the night because my father was screaming. And at the time I didn't understand why he was screaming. But I think he was screaming because of the fear they had, and that he had nightmares, recurring nightmares about the war.
Yeah.
My mother once told me about the dentist, that my father had a tooth that had to be coming out. They couldn't get an anesthetic. My father was scared stiff of the dentist. And 6 people held him down, apparently, when they extracted this tooth. I don't know who did it, if it was a proper dentist. And my father screamed. My mother she told me about this screaming. And I wondered if that was part of the screaming in the night, you know. I don't know. But for the rest of his life, he was always frightened of the dentist. And to come back after the war and not know what's happened to your family must have been horrendous. Yeah. Well, the town of Veendam, they erected a monument. I don't know quite when or the original monument was erected. And then a few years back, I was invited by the mayor of Veendam because they were redoing the monument and remembering some of my family, my great-uncle and aunt and their children. And my mother didn't really like me going over. I used to go for every single birthday that she had. I missed one in all the time she was alive when I lived in England. And this particular time I wanted to go to this occasion because it was one way to go back to Veendam where my father was born and where my grandparents lived, in a way to say goodbye to my grandparents and my aunt that I never knew. And my mother was going to go, and she said, you only come over to Holland for bad things, because the Hidden Child Conference was an example. Then I met up with some of the people that were in my group in the Hidden Child Conference a few times. And then, of course, I went to this Veendam, which was quite interesting to me because it was on the corner of Bendik Street, my maiden name, because my grandfather was mayor of the town, or my great-grandfather was mayor of Veendam. And so the street was named after him.
So was your father called Benjamin Bendik?
Yeah.
Right.
Benjamin Philippus Bendik.
Right.
Yeah. I came to Britain on the 14th of February 1965. I had all my education in Holland. I worked in Holland, as I said, in the well, actually, when I first had glandular fever, I couldn't straight away go into nursing because I wouldn't pass the medical. So I became a receptionist in a hotel in Rotterdam. The hotel belonged to a very good friend of my father's who had 2 hotels. And that's where I met my first husband, in the hotel. And that's how I came to live in England. And I came to England in '65 to marry my first husband. He and other officers worked for Esso, and they had been in Rotterdam for about 6 months overseeing the building of the Esso Cardiff, which was a big tanker. And the tanker was finished, so they came back to the UK. He was for a while stationed in, I think it was Millbank, where Esso had their head office, and came back to Holland to meet up with some of the friends he made while he was staying in Holland for that period of time. And as he walked in the hotel, of course, I'd been told about the officers because the manageress had got married to the first mate. Yeah. No, she had married to the first mate. One of the receptionists got married to the second mate, and they both started to. They then went to live in England.
So romance was in the air, and
and then he walked in, and he just said, "My name is so and so, and the manageress is expecting me." Yeah. And 4 days later, he asked me to marry him. So it was a bit romantic.
Whirlwind.
Yeah, it was a whirlwind. My parents didn't approve because he wasn't Jewish, but they never introduced me really to a Jewish suitable candidate to be my husband. Yeah. Got married in England, have 3 children, Miriam, Samuel and Ruth. And then sadly my marriage broke up and I remarried in 1979 and was very happy and was married to my second husband for 27 years. And my second husband, Edward, died on the 10th of April 2006. Very sad. Yeah. Then my mother died 3 months later, on the 14th of July 2006. It was her wedding anniversary. My father had died in 1975, so she had been widowed for a very long time. She was only 56, 57 when my father died, and she was 87 when she died. So she was on her own for a long time, and I admired her for that, although our relationship was a difficult relationship. Because she always felt she hadn't bonded with me, and I understood that later when I had children myself. I didn't understand it when I was younger. I lived in Osterley in Middlesex, near Hounslow. And I lived there from 1965 until we moved to Halifax. We lived there for 26 years in Halifax. And then, sadly, about 12 and a half years into my marriage, my first marriage broke up. And my first husband left. And then he later remarried and went to live on the island of Arran. And tragically, he died last September. I don't mean September gone, the year before, in 2011. September 2011 he died. And as I said, and he was called John Moore was his name, John Moore. I didn't know about the synagogue then, you see, because with my first husband, as I explained before, we promised each other we wouldn't follow our religion so that the children wouldn't be influenced by one more than the other. But I've regretted that very much. Not at the time, because I thought it was the fairest thing to do. But in England, when the children went to school, there happened to be Church of England schools. And even if there hadn't been Church of England schools, I think it's still the case that in law, the only subject has to be taught is religion in the UK. So they were certainly taught Christianity. And I did speak to the headmaster about it, a very nice gentleman, Mr. Lister. But he advised me against taking the children out of assembly because he said they would be ostracized. They would be sort of as you know, maybe not special as I thought, but he advised me not to do it. He said because we don't really go into Christianity that deep. We more teach morals. So I felt that he probably was right, and I therefore allowed it all to happen, but realized that really that there was very much a Christian base to it. But none of my children, unfortunately, are religious. My second husband, Edward Dye, he died, as I already told you, on the 10th of April 2006. He died in Manor Hospice. Hence, I do a lot of voluntary work for the hospice. I set up a fundraising group for Manor Hospice, and we've raised, with my little group, in just over 5 years, we've raised over £50,000 for the hospice. I worked for a company called, when my first marriage broke up, I started there. There were two things I could do. I could either say, oh, feel sorry for me, hold my hands up and say to the government, I'm a lone parent. In those days, still a bit shameful, actually. Or I could say, wait a minute, I have two hands, I can do something. And so I went on a training opportunity scheme course, a secretarial course, and was the first one of that group to get a job. And my first job was Illingworth Carpets. I worked in the export department. Literally, as soon as I arrived there, I realized I was one of those people who wouldn't fit in with those people. But I did need the money, and also I did need to get a reference. So I really tried hard and stayed for 2 years. And then I saw a job advertised which was for more money at Bulmer and Lum. They were spinners, dyers, top makers, spinners and dyers in Buttershaw. And whilst I was working there, my boss, King Macaulay, was going to be the president of the Bradford Textile Society, and asked me to assist him because they used to have a little dinner party before the meetings. So the president would invite guests, the speaker and some other guests. And he was followed by Roy Stroud. Before I got the job at Bulmer Lum, I was actually interviewed for that job was a director's secretary by Walter Kellner, who was a member of this Reformed synagogue. Walter was an amazing man, and his wife Josephine. And Walter interviewed me. I immediately, as soon as I met him, knew he was a Jew. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind. He didn't realize I was, and I sort of made it clear in the interview. I just asked him where he came from. I was trying to interview him, and I let it then be known that I was Jewish. But he never introduced me to the Reformed Synagogue. I didn't know he was a member here. And then through the Textile Society, I met Roy Stroud. And Roy said, "Why haven't we ever seen you in synagogue?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't aware there were some synagogues nearby." And he invited me to the Hanukkah service here in the Reformed Synagogue, which Edward and my children and I attended. I can still see myself sitting where I sat. And then he said, "Why not come home with us?" And home was actually at his mother's. We went to his mother's house. His mother was, I think, called Clara. Roy's mother, Roy Stroud's mother. So in a way, it is Roy who brought me back to Judaism, and I owe him a great debt, really. And I started very slowly coming to synagogue, relearning my Hebrew, and for a long time I was very happy. Within a very short period of time, I was on the council here and enjoyed that. And my husband, Edward, very much encouraged me. He sometimes came with me. And I even took services and took the scrolls out of the ark, which to me was unheard of for a woman to do that. So it was a bit alien. But I did enjoy being part of the community. And then very slowly and gradually I got disenchanted and discovered through my installation as president of B'nai Brit that there was actually an Orthodox synagogue. And we had a few lunches in the Orthodox synagogue. And I approached Albert Waxman and asked if they ever had members who had married out. And he said yes, they did. And I would be very welcome. But he encouraged me to think about it very carefully, because he said, once you make that step, you can't go back. And I promised I would think about it, but actually I'd already made up my mind. But I took the time and thought about it very carefully, because I was worried to upset Roy, because he and his wife had been very kind to me. I felt that going behind his back I was almost betraying him, although I wasn't really. And anyway, the day came that I wrote my letter to Albert to say, could I become a member at the Orthodox synagogue? My initial intention was to stay a member here, but realized that that was really not a good idea. And once I had a letter from the Hebrew congregation, Bradford Hebrew congregation, that I was accepted, I then wrote to Roy. I've never looked back, and there is a fondness for the Reformed Synagogue, for the people here, and Rudy and the Fabians and the Dysons, and indeed Solomons, they in particular, and of course before that the Ellingers and the Rothschilds, especially the Strausses. I mean, I would put those first actually, because it was through Roy that I came back to Judaism, and I am as I said before, I'm really grateful to Roy for that. Because I started studying, and when reading, I couldn't possibly read straight from the scrolls. So probably Walter or somebody, I think it was Walter actually, Walter Rothschild, he used to give you, I suppose, a copy from the Chumash, and then I would learn it by heart and literally do my piece, which was amazing if you think about it. And I think an advantage with the service itself is that part is in English and part is in Hebrew. So it's much easier to follow than in the Orthodox, because although I can read it relatively fluently, I have absolutely no idea what I'm reading unless I read the English. It was special, because in the Orthodox synagogue you don't get that opportunity. Most of the Orthodox synagogue members, of course, knew each other 30, 40 years. I was an off-cumbent in a way, I came into this, and it took a long time before I was accepted. And to me, they were my family because I didn't have any close family nearby. And that's how I look upon Lily and Albert, you know, it's really my family, as it were. Bradford, this decline in Judaism in Bradford is obviously exceedingly sad because at one time, I think the wool trade may not have survived without the Jews. Maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but a lot of Jewish people were involved in the textile industry. The other thing is to have Jewish mayors.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'd like to remember Olive Messer,
Yeah.
because the year that I was chairman of the Bradford Textile Society, she actually came to the dinner. We used to have a big dinner. And also, Lord Seif of Marks and Spencer came to the dinner. He actually sat next to me. So that was quite something as a little girl there, between all these men, 600 men with a handful of ladies, to have to do an address to the people of industry. You know, it was quite something. Yeah. It was on the 5th of December, and of course in the Netherlands, the 5th of December is St. Nicholas. So I had to say thank you on behalf of all the people who were on the top table. So with Lord Seif next to me, I could start off by saying St. Nicholas had a very good friend, St. Michael. Oh, right. And I did it all in rhyme. I've still got that, actually. I worked in Bradford. Well, Illingworth Carpets was at Shelf, which is part of Bradford. Then I worked for Boomer and Lamb, which was at Buttershaw. And then I worked for Trade Indemnity. I had an office in Foster Square. Credit Insurance. I became a member of the Bradford Chamber of Commerce. For a woman, quite unusual. I think I was the second lady on the council. I was heavily involved in the Institute of Credit Management. I was on their committee for a while. So yeah, I've done quite a few things. I think it's important that the memories of the people who are no longer with us live on, and this is one way that I can achieve for that to happen.
Yeah.
And that's why I do my talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Plus, we must never forget the Holocaust.